morning, everyone. Thank you for coming for the third presentation of our Friday Student Scholar Day. I'm so happy to see my fellow art colleagues here. And please join me in welcoming Dana Province and his students.
Welcome as well, and I appreciate you coming out. It's a pleasure to introduce Troy, and he's been wonderful to work with, and he's done a fantastic job leading up to his thesis show, and he's going to share that with you in this presentation. So,
Thank you, Dan. So we'll work through the little technical thing here. So my name is Troy Parker, as Dana said, and today I'll be presenting my BFA sculpture thesis project, Intervals in the Substance of Space. Let's see. Guess it's not going to do that. So. I'm just going to have to work with that. So what is space? Is space physical and real, or a construct of the human mind? For many, space is a void that must be filled or somehow controlled. For others, it is a place of uncertainty or fear. The Japanese use the term ma to describe space. To them, space is the interval in between, a concept that can include both space and time, has substance, and is part of the whole. Throughout much of history, this link between space and time was a concept foreign to the Western mind. Albert Einstein's work on relativity in the early 20th century changed this by linking space and time into a singular continuum known as space-time. Einstein's work redescribed time not as a constant, but as a relative measurement that can change as determined by the position of the observer. Through the use of a large-scale mixed-media sculptural installation, this thesis exhibition explores how physical, psychological, and temporal factors influence our perceptions regarding the substance of space. Some areas we're going to look at in the presentation include the concept, which will also include historical background and conceptual concerns. And then we'll look at the project itself, which will include a description of the project, research and media, and the process that I used to develop intervals. The concept. In the pre-Renaissance period, Western cosmology held that the Earth was the center of the universe, space was finite, and there was no linear, and time was a linear constant with no direct connection to space. During the Renaissance, this changed when Nicholas Copernicus scientifically described the sun, how the sun was at the center of the solar system, and that the universe was actually infinite. In his book, The Copernican Revolution, physicist and philosopher of science Thomas S. Kuhn wrote that the Copernican revolution produced a transformation in man's conception of the universe and of his own relation to it, and has been proclaimed an epochal turning point in the intellectual development of Western man. This fundamental change to Western cosmology, when combined with the newly declared rights of personal independence and individual expression as a result of the humanism movement, would fuel the Renaissance and really lead to the development of the modern mind as we know it today. The event that would forever solidify the new cosmology was Albert Einstein's aforementioned work on relativity. The implication of Einstein's theory that time and space are both relative shook society to its core, with many artists of the day grabbing onto the concept and attempting to explain it through their work. And we see that here with Dali's image of the persistence of memories. So this thesis exhibition, Intervals, is a response to these events with the work directly exploring the relative nature of space-time in the interaction of both concrete and abstract entities within space-time. So, and with any artwork, artists were largely we're heavily influenced by people from the past and work we've seen throughout time. So generally speaking, it would be difficult to place this body of work within the boundaries of any particular art movement or directly link it to the work of a specific artist, though some influences do exist. Those who have influenced my work would include Marcel Duchamp and Anthony Gormley, who's a sculptor, and then the architect I.M. Pei. Marcel Duchamp was one of the most important artists of the 20th century. And Duchamp was a revolutionary artist who was deeply committed to creating work that challenged both the mind of the viewer and the rigid institutional structure of early 20th century art. And we see this in his New Descending Staircase No. 2, which was very controversial and revolutionary for its time. Remarkably, New Descending Staircase No. 2 is very similar to the graphic figure that is common use today by educators when they're describing the space-time interval. And even though Duchamp was not actually trying to describe space-time specifically, there was kind of a convergence of thought at the same time in the early 20th century. Anthony Gormley is the contemporary artist that has arguably devoted the most time and effort in exploring space-time. And over the past few decades, Gormley has continually pushed himself to really explore that in its relationship to man. And Gormley himself states, "For me, sculpture is no longer about the representation of power or about how a person might express their wealth or power. It is about how we might understand our own embodiment in both space and time." I.M. Pei, who's a Chinese architect and is also responsible for the mall down in Denver and a lot of other works. The pyramid at the Louvre is another one of his works. Often embodies the fundamental nature of Ma and the concept of the interval. The world-renowned Niho Museum, which this is a picture of in Japan, is perhaps his greatest achievement in regards to incorporating the concept of Ma into a design. The way he designed it, he put significant portions of the structure under the ground and with the exposed elements arranged in a manner that would interrelate to themselves and the woody, mountainous environment around it. It's really a real design of genius, in my opinion. So another thing we want to look at is the nature of space. What is space? And we've kind of addressed that issue already a little bit. And since antiquity, many of humanity's greatest thinkers have attempted to describe the nature of space. A feature common to these explorations is that the answers often contain components of science and philosophy, and some of those answers actually include areas that would be considered more metaphysical in nature or something that requires extra knowledge, in a sense. And in this presentation, or in this exhibition project, I use the philosophical framework of constructive postmodern pluralism. Interval directly examines the relationship between concrete and abstract entities. And constructive postmodern pluralism is a relatively new approach that first appeared in the 1990s. And to best understand constructive postmodern pluralism, it's helpful to look at the philosophical predecessors to it, modernism and postmodernism. And the University of Virginia's The Electronic Labyrinth has a fairly concise summary of those two. And modernism can be described as the Enlightenment humanist rejection of tradition and authority in favor of reason and natural science. Progress and novelty are valorized within a linear conception of history. Looking at postmodernism, it is a rejection of the sovereign autonomous individual with an emphasis on anarchic collective, anonymous experience, the dissolution of distinctions, the merging of subject and object, self and other, and it's basically an anarchist rejection of all attempts to define the human subject. Pretty much a free-for-all when you look at it. So looking at constructive postmodern pluralism and really what it's about, we build on both modernism and postmodernism, and constructive postmodern pluralism generally rejects the reductive empiricism of modernism, and it rejects the postmodernism deconstructive relativism and its demand for sameness. Basically that merging the self and other objects together. Furthermore, it seeks to actively construct new methods of perception through the inclusion of a wide variety of thoughts, observations, influences such as the role of the human experience, something that is often not taken into account with modernism and postmodernism. And really the key there is that it's a constructive process, trying to build something instead of tearing down and isolating. We want to build something out of somewhat disassociated elements. So in the development of intervals, the flexibility, the support for this flexibility of thought has really been a vital factor in putting together the conceptual ideas, which is where I really started with it, and then the physical development of intervals itself. And looking at the word Ma a little bit more and what it really means, noted East Asian scholar Dr. Henry Smith of Columbia University states, in Japanese, Ma, the word for space, suggests interval. It is best described as a consciousness of place, not in the sense of an enclosed, three-dimensional entity, but rather the simultaneous awareness of form and non-form, deriving from an intensification of vision. Furthermore, Ma is not something that is created by compositional elements. It is the thing that takes place in the imagination of the human who experiences the elements. Therefore, Ma cannot be defined as an experiential place. Therefore, Ma can be defined as an experiential place, understood with emphasis on the interval. So, really, Ma is not something that you can define and quantify. It's something that you feel after being enveloped in a space or a series of experiences. And in intervals, we explore the experiential aspect of Ma by positioning the viewer within the installation, as we'll observe in a minute. And with that, the viewer is to observe the physical and temporal aspects of the work and potentially developing a psychological response to the same. The project itself, it's fair to say that with some of the medium clay being new to me, which is the primary medium, this was a real push, and but a lot of fun at the same time. So intervals, which will be installed coming up in a couple weeks in the Cloyd Snook Gallery, is an immersive site-specific installation. Site-specific meaning that I actually designed it to fit within the gallery itself. And it was designed to take advantage of the unique concentric curved exhibition space of the Cloyd Snook Gallery. And it's pretty unusual space when we look at most gallery spaces being rectangular, more hard lines and such. So it's been a lot of fun trying to figure out a project that would work within that space. Immediately demanding the attention of the viewer when they enter the space are the 6 large organically shaped forms that are shallow basins of water that are placed in a seemingly random pattern throughout the exhibition space. And you can see here in this simple drawing kind of an overhead view of what it's going to look like if you were up on the second level. And the basins themselves serve as the primary foundational element for this installation, and they'll cover an area of about 500 square feet total with the pathways in between. And they'll stand about 6 inches off the ground and then filled with water. And then strategically placed within the pools are 9 heavily carved conical forms that are neutral toned colored clay that were originally thrown as conical forms, and then I carved into them to arrive at the final shape. And you can see one of those over there. That's the smallest one at a little bit under 3 feet fired, with the tallest one unfired at almost 7 feet and weighing about 225 pounds. And so a pretty significant challenge for me to throw on the wheel. And not readily apparent when you first enter the space is the temporal element of the work. And this is expressed through small traveling waves that move across the surface of the water. And this feature strongly supports the concept of Ma as the interval in between. And it's something that it's my hope that people will be able to go into the space and over time, as they're viewing it, try to begin to sense the energy that's coming from those traveling waves and the connection between the different concrete entities, which are the event towers and themselves and the entire space, kind of creating that experiential space of Ma that we talked about earlier. And in developing intervals, as a sculpture major who hasn't really worked with clay a whole lot, in fact I've only started working with clay about a little over a year ago, there was a lot of research that I needed to do and testing in order to successfully develop the project. And the project is conceptual in nature, and with that, and my focus on craft and things like that, it really distanced itself from the conceptual art movement of the 20th century through the importance placed on craft, which means the attention to detail and all things being considered in the installation and such. And then the use of specific media to help formulate a conceptual language. In the development of intervals, we used a number of materials and techniques were considered and tested before arriving at the use of the segmented and heavily carved clay forms that you see there, which has two sections to it. And those are the main focal point. And then the use of shallow basins of water as the project's foundation and a temporal medium. So we're going to have like just two basic medias there with clay forms and then the water. And the reason I chose clay was really its ability to convey the conceptual concerns, the diversity of form that it provides. It's a reasonable cost. It's such a large project. I had really budget was a major factor, and then a relatively fast production time. If we're looking at other materials such as bronze and things like that, that could really, it would take me 2 or 3 years to do something like this probably. And then the water serves as a unifying element and creates a sense of place. And then I also liked its capability to convey the temporal factors. Its dynamic nature and flowing nature is really important in that aspect. Looking at the process itself, and this was, as I've said before, was quite a challenge. And the construction of the event towers, with the largest one being about 7 feet, unfired using 225 pounds of clay total, was involved a construct, deconstruct, reconstruct process that we'll look at here. And this process was developed in response to the maximum height capability of the firing kilns, which is about 28 inches, 27 inches, based on which kiln we're going to be firing in at the time. And starting with upwards of about 100 pounds of centered clay on the wheel, as we see here, this is about 50 pounds actually on an 18-inch bat. Each event tower was created by throwing and stacking multiple sections until the desired height was achieved. And what I'm going to do here is show you an image sequence of the build process itself. And here you can see as I've gone ahead and laid it out, and then centered the bottom, add another whole bag of clay, that's 25 pounds of clay on top of the centered section, and then we keep building it up as we go here. And this is the final form. This is a 5-footer, and it took about, I think, 175 pounds of clay to build this. After the final form was completed, the next thing we needed to do was section the work. And what I did there was I measured it out based on the total height and dividing that up between what could go in the kiln, and for a 5-footer that would be a 3-section tower, with each piece being 24 to 28 inches. And those vary a little bit so that they're not hard and fast lines. And you can see here I've got an incised line, and then I put a template on that, which I'll show you the purpose of in a second, where I basically use the tracing paper to pull off a template that will go into profiling the temporary base that is used to support the individual sections and during firing. Okay, so basically we took the template, we profiled it, and we ended up with a very low profile base that would hold the temporary sections in the kiln. Finally, the pattern was determined and the individual sections were carved. These were air dried, usually for a week or so, bisque fired to cone 08, and then glazed and fired to cone 6, which is a mid-range clay. And you can see here the heavy cellular pattern that was carved into the pattern. And those vary from form to form, and it's all free-form, just sketched out and then carved into the towers. And you can see the process here, with the second section on top and then building up from there. The basins are constructed using plywood floors and a framed wall that utilizes thin plywood strips to form the curved sections. This hollow wall also houses an air pump system that is being used to create the traveling waves across the surface of the water. And the traveling waves are created using a bubble of air that releases below the surface of the water and it rises and disrupts the surface. And you can see in this picture here, there's some electronics and a pump, and that's what we're using to create the air bubbles. And those are created using an Arduino computer controller. And we have a box over there, you can see the clear box with an Arduino controller. And it's basically a computer board with some solid state relays that is custom programmed as a standalone computer device to actuate the pump at different intervals. And those are going to vary throughout so that no one basin is being actuated at the same time as another, and it'll create a lot of variation in the installation. In the development of intervals, starting at the beginning of the spring semester is when the initial construction started. From that time, I've used about 1,300 pounds of clay, which is a significant amount. And from that, I was able to recover from the carving about 300 pounds that we will reuse. We'll put through the pug mill and be able to reuse. And then there's some waste, a little bit, contaminated, falling on the floor, things like that. Wood, I'm using about 40 sheets of plywood, 20 sheets of Luan plywood, 6 gallons of epoxy resin. And I think most significant is the construction time is about 800 hours. So it's been a bit of a push, and but a lot of fun at the same time, and I've learned a lot in the process. As a work in progress, intervals will be completed within the next 2 weeks and then installed in the Cloyd Snook Gallery for the 2014 BFA thesis exhibition. And that's going to happen at the end of this month. So, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present intervals, and I'd really like to invite you to view the installation. It's really hard for me to fully explain what it's all about, and I would hope that you can come to the exhibition from starting April 21st through May 7th or May 9th, and the closing reception on May 9th from 5 to 7 p.m. And stop by, check it out, and maybe even go to a time when it's a little bit quieter so you can spend a little time in the space and getting a sense of what it's really about. So once again, I'd like to thank you, and if there are any questions or comments on the project, open for that. I think we have a little bit of time left. Anybody? Gustavo?
How big is the pump that you have? Because the bottom section is going to be 6 inches tall. Is that going to be small enough to bake in it?
Yeah, they're hollow wall. The walls are hollow because it's going to be built up like a frame, like a regular wall, but just very short.
Okay.
And they're going to be about 3.5 inches on the inside of those walls. And the pumps are actually 3 3/4 inch wide. So I'm going to widen those areas a little bit. I'm going to fur out the wall when I'm building it. And they'll just sit right inside. And there'll be a plate on the top that will allow me access to change out valving and things like that, adjustments. Yeah.
Did you also have to figure out the programming for your pump, or were you able to find that online? Or?
I started with a basic program that Dana actually used for his installation last year, and the boat project, and then that's modified. But it's built on a programming language called processing, and the Arduino boards are built for that language essentially. And so you just go in and you program it, and it's very simple. It's not too hard to learn. If you've done any programming before, it's pretty simple to figure it out. But yeah, it's basically a custom program you write on the computer, and then you connect the Arduino board via USB, and you upload that to the board, and then it's a standalone unit. So
As you were talking, you said that it's gonna end up being 800 hours to get everything said and done. Was there ever a point in your process where you were reconsidering doing something or cutting corners, so to speak, in order to cut down that time where maybe you thought what you were trying to achieve was, kind of out of your reach?
Not yet. It's not over though. We really did a lot of research and I really planned it out. So it's taken a little bit longer than I originally expected, but within about 15% or so probably. Because those that know me know I plan everything. Maybe too much sometimes, but it works for me. But yeah, it really built over time, so there wasn't a lot of stepping back saying you can't do that.
Right.
Though with things like surface treatment, the glazes and things like that, at some point I had to call it and say, okay, you gotta go with this. Okay.
In front of the group, I just want to acknowledge that Troy has worked so hard on his ceramic forms. That's what I see him working on. And, as he said, he just started doing ceramics about a year ago. And the fact that he can throw those forms in the pottery wheel, it's almost like a miracle. He has worked so hard and so tirelessly over and over and over just practicing. I'm so proud of you and I'm so impressed with your skill level and how you really translated that. And also you've inspired the students in my classes. They see you working all the time, they see you not giving up, and it's really helped us in the studio. So thank you for all of your effort, and I hope everyone can acknowledge how hard you have worked to create those forms.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Why did you choose a conical form?
There's a lot of things that inspired this project, but it's not one specific thing or another. And kind of the genesis of it, the thing I can really relate to for inspiration was the last documentary film I worked on. It used to be an extreme environment documentary photographer and videographer, and which I stopped doing in 2009. And we're on the top of Mount Hood after a pretty difficult climb, which it is not a difficult mountain, but the weather was really horrible. We got pushed down the mountain 3 times. And out of 17 climbers from all around the world, only 2 of us summited it, myself and my climbing partner from Wales. And we were standing on top of the mountain, and we were looking off to the north to Rainier and some of the other Cascade Peaks, and there was all this marine layer in. And I could just see the conical forms coming up through the marine layer of fog and clouds. And it just really struck me how important that space in between was, which I didn't identify as the interval at that time, but with further research and my interest in Japanese philosophical views, I discovered it and it just hit me that that's what it was. So just went with it. Any other questions?
Great, thank you so much, Troy.
All right, thank you.